Picture this. It's January 1871. We're standing inside the absolute glittering opulence of the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. A brand new empire is literally being born right in front of us. But if you look around, you're not seeing a celebration of French triumph. No way. Instead, what you're witnessing is Germany's greatest victory, proclaimed right on top of the ashes of a completely humiliating French defeat. And the guy standing behind it all, the one pulling every single string, he isn't a conquering king. He's not some frontline general. He's a master strategist who rarely, if ever, fired a shot himself. His name is Otto von Bismarck. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unravel what might honestly be the greatest political heist of the entire 19th century.
Because that brings us to the central mystery of our thriller today. How exactly did one politician, a guy with no royal crown of his own, manage to completely reshape Europe? How did he take dozens of fractured, entirely independent German states and forge them into one of the most powerful and, let's be real, terrifying empires on the continent? Well, everything we're diving into today points right back to this one staggering achievement. It's a crazy story of manipulation, of ruthless calculations, and of a man who basically treated the entire map of Europe like a giant chessboard, where every other leader was just a pawn for him to play.
Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1. The Fractured Board, a Divided Germany.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of what Bismarck pulled off, we have to look at the board before the game even began. We're talking about the post-Napoleonic landscape of 1815. When Napoleon was finally out of the picture, the victorious powers got together at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the borders of Europe. And the geopolitical puzzle they created in Central Europe, it was intentionally designed to be practically impossible to put together. They formed the German Confederation, which was this super loose, deeply fragmented association of exactly 39 independent, mostly German-speaking states. Now you might be wondering, why 39? Well, because this confederation was absolutely never meant to be a unified nation. Actually, scratch that. It was the exact opposite. It was deliberately structured to be this massive geographic buffer zone designed specifically to keep Central Europe weak, divided, and totally incapable of ever threatening its neighbors again.
But here's where things get really messy. The main problem, the thing paralyzing this whole confederation, was this deep, systemic rivalry known as German dualism. You've got these two absolute heavyweights locked in a massive power struggle. On one side, you have the traditional powerhouse, the Austrian Empire. We're talking a vast, multi-ethnic Catholic domain ruled by the ancient Habsburg dynasty. They wanted a greater Germany, where Austria held all the cards. But then, on the other side, you have the rising challenger, the Kingdom of Prussia. They were Protestant, rapidly industrializing, hyper-disciplined, and they pushed for a lesser Germany, one that conveniently excluded Austria entirely. This bitter rivalry just completely paralyzed the whole region. The game was totally gridlocked. Someone needed to flip the board.
Which brings us to Part 2. Enter the mastermind, Otto von Bismarck.
Let's jump to 1862. The Prussian king Wilhelm I is facing a massive crisis. His liberal parliament is flat out refusing to fund his military. To fix this, he brings in a 46-year-old conservative noble named Otto von Bismarck to be his minister-president. Now, Bismarck was a junker, meaning he was part of the traditional landowning Prussian aristocracy. He was highly educated, totally cosmopolitan, but man, he was deeply absolutist. He absolutely despised liberalism and had this fierce, ruthless loyalty to the Prussian monarchy. And along with that loyalty, Bismarck brought this chillingly pragmatic philosophy called Realpolitik. Basically, Realpolitik dictates that absolute power and hard material interests matter way more than morals, ideals, or whatever a constitution says. To Bismarck, if a piece of paper or a parliamentary vote got in the way of Prussian dominance, it was literally irrelevant.
And he definitely didn't hide this philosophy either. Just days after getting appointed in September 1862, Bismarck stood right in front of the budget committee of that same rebellious parliament and dropped this legendary, bone-chilling quote. He said, "The position of Prussia in Germany will be determined not by its liberalism, but by its power. Not through speeches and majority decisions are the great questions of the day decided. That was the mistake of 1848 and 1849, but through blood and iron." Boom. He was boldly putting them on notice. He was fully prepared to bypass the legislature and use raw, brute military force to smash right through their political deadlock.
So, Part 3. Forging Blood and Iron, the Prussian War Machine.
The thing is, a mastermind can't execute a grand vision without the right tools, right? To actually forge an empire out of blood and iron, Bismarck needed a literal war machine.
So he turned to two highly conservative military geniuses, Count Helmuth von Moltke, Chief of the General Staff, and Count Albert von Roon, the Minister of War. Let's look at how von Roon totally transformed this army, even while facing bitter pushback from the Liberal Parliament. He rolled out this three-step overhaul. First, he strictly enforced universal conscription, meaning every citizen had to serve. Second, he dropped the liability period down to 16 years. This was brilliant because it rapidly cycled trained men into a massive reserve force. And third, and this is arguably the real game changer here, he armed the infantry with a devastating new piece of tech, the breech-loading needle gun. This thing vastly outpaced the firing rate of the old traditional muskets.
Now, these maneuvers were heavily contested and deeply unconstitutional, but the results were just staggering. Prussia suddenly possessed this highly mechanized, fiercely disciplined standing army of 371,000 men. Think about that for a second. Bismarck literally just ignored the parliament when they refused to approve the budget, went ahead and collected the taxes anyway, and handed this massive lethal weapon over to his generals. He finally had the exact tool he needed to execute his grand plan. Moving on to Part 4, a masterclass in war, the Three Gambits. Over the next 7 years, Bismarck puts on an absolute masterclass in diplomacy and warfare. We're talking treaties broken, allies betrayed, and the entire map of Europe getting completely redrawn. When you look at the sheer speed of his execution, it is honestly breathtaking. In 1864, the Danish War. 1866, the Austro-Prussian War. 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. Bismarck toppled these established European powers one by one, like a perfectly lined up row of dominoes. And his genius was ensuring that in every single conflict, Prussia's enemy was totally isolated diplomatically before a single shot was even fired. The very first domino to fall was Denmark in 1864. So a dispute pops up over who gets to administer the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Bismarck does something wild here. He actually convinces his ultimate rival, Austria, to team up with Prussia to defeat Denmark. But see, this wasn't just a land grab. It was a brilliantly deceptive trap. By bringing Austria in to jointly manage these newly conquered lands, Bismarck was intentionally manufacturing a crisis. It's kind of like forcing two bitter exes into a joint custody agreement over a piece of property. It was pure, calculated administrative friction designed to fail from day one. He was perfectly setting the stage for his next war. And sure enough, just 2 years later, in 1866, Bismarck springs the trap. Using all those manufactured arguments over Schleswig-Holstein, he deliberately provokes a war with his temporary ally, Austria. He smartly locks in an alliance with Italy to split Austria's focus, and then he unleashes von Roon's upgraded needle gun-wielding army. Guys, the war was over in just 7 weeks. Prussia decisively, completely crushed the Austrian forces. This ruthlessly efficient move permanently killed the whole Greater Germany debate and officially exiled the Austrian Empire from German affairs for good, which completely cleared the way for Prussia to form the North German Confederation.
Okay, so now you have these remaining independent southern German states. Historically, they were terrified of being dominated by Protestant Prussia. So how do you get them to willingly surrender their sovereignty to you? Simple. You find them a much, much more terrifying common enemy. In 1870, using some incredibly complex diplomacy and some very carefully edited communications, Bismarck actively baits French Emperor Napoleon III into declaring war on Prussia. This sudden aggression from France completely panicked those southern German states, driving them straight into the protective arms of the Prussian military.
And that leads us to Part 5, The Empire Forged, Versailles, 1871.
Unsurprisingly, the Prussian-led coalition absolutely decimates the French forces. And this brings our whole narrative full circle, right back to where we started at the beginning, the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, January 1871. With the French Empire literally collapsing around them, the victorious German princes gathered to proclaim the birth of the new German Empire. Bismarck had done the impossible. He actually unified Germany. But let's look at the ultimate twist of this massive political heist, the Constitution itself. When you break down these new institutions, it is glaringly obvious that Bismarck rigged the entire federal system to guarantee conservative Prussian domination forever. The King of Prussia becomes the Emperor, keeping absolute military control. The Chancellor, a role Bismarck naturally steps right into, is accountable solely to the Emperor. This totally bypasses the elected parliament, the Reichstag, which couldn't even introduce binding bills.
But the absolute most devious, brilliant linchpin of this entire constitution is the number 17. See, in the newly formed Federal Council, which represented all the state governments, it took exactly 14 votes to veto any constitutional changes. Well, guess how many votes Prussia assigned to itself? Yep, exactly 17. Through simple math, Bismarck mathematically guaranteed that Prussia held an absolute unbreakable veto over the entire German Empire. It looked like a federation on paper, but it was a brilliant illusion masking an absolute Prussian autocracy.
Finally, Part 6, Legacy, the Price of Blood and Iron. So after pulling all this off, how does a mastermind actually hold on to his prize? Well, for the next 2 decades, the Iron Chancellor shifts his focus entirely. On the home front, to pacify the working class and stop socialist uprisings in their tracks, he implements the world's first modern social security and workers' compensation programs. It was a classic, brilliant application of Realpolitik. He literally just bought internal peace. And internationally, he spins this wildly complex web of alliances specifically designed to politically and militarily isolate a very vengeful France. When you look at his overall achievements, they're almost hard to fully wrap your head around. He defeated 2 massive historic empires. He completely upended the continental balance of power, basically ripping up the old Congress Vienna settlements. And he oversaw this huge economic and industrial boom that allowed Germany to rival Great Britain. He took a fractured, paralyzed collection of buffer states and forged an absolute titan of military and economic strength.
There's no denying Bismarck built a superpower, and he successfully managed a really fragile peace for decades through sheer diplomatic genius. But when he was eventually pushed out by a new, much more aggressive Kaiser, that intricate web of alliances he built started to fracture. Which really leaves us to wonder, did the ruthless Realpolitik, the constant deceit, and the very foundation of blood and iron that forged the German nation, did it inherently program the continent for the devastating collision of World War I? It is a pretty dark thought to leave you with, for sure, but an absolutely essential one if we want to understand the world that followed. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world today.